They say history remembers conquerors, but this story begins with a disappearance. One Roman ambassador vanished without a trace. The next was returned, in pieces. No letter, no declaration, just silence. And then, chaos. The Adriatic Sea grew quiet. Too quiet. Ships stopped sailing. Ports locked their gates. Fishermen whispered prayers instead of casting nets. Something unseen was moving through the water, and every captain knew this was no storm. This was war. But not the kind Rome was used to. She didn't rise from gold or marble. She didn't rule from columns or councils. She came from the cliffs and the salt and the iron of the coast. She was not bred in diplomacy. She was born in defiance. Teuta, Queen of Illyria, widow, warrior, pirate, shadow. She did not wait to be respected. She made herself feared. To the empire, she was a barbarian, an outlaw who turned her people into blades. To her enemies, she was a ghost cloaked in fire. But to her own, she was the sea itself, restless, endless, and impossible to chain. Her crown was not inherited. It was taken. They thought she would crumble after the death of her husband. They expected chaos, weakness, surrender. Instead, she gave them resistance, sharpened into steel. When Rome reached across the sea, claiming order and civility, she met them not with words, but with ships, fast, ruthless, and unrelenting. She struck in the dead of night. She struck where they felt most untouchable. She struck first. Roman vessels vanished into the deep. Greek cities begged for mercy. Trade routes turned into killing fields. And every shattered hull that washed ashore bore her message: you will not own this sea. The empire responded with arrogance. They demanded answers. They demanded obedience. They demanded her silence. She answered with war, because the sea was never Rome's. It was hers, and it remembers. There are stories carved in stone, hidden in tombs, whispered through ruins. Secrets they never taught in school, because some truths were never meant to be told. Here on Secrets of the Ancient World, we don't just explore history, we decode it, piece by piece, lie by lie, until the truth finally rises. If you've ever felt like the past was deeper than what they told us, if you're drawn to the shadows beneath the pyramids and the questions buried beneath centuries of silence, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Secrets of the Ancient World and discover what was never meant to survive time. Before the fires burned on the water, before Rome marched east, before a queen made the sea her weapon, there was Illyria, a land born of stone and sea, harsh, rugged, beautiful in its violence. Stretching along the Western Balkans, Illyria was a fractured mirror of a civilization, shattered into tribes, scattered across mountain valleys and jagged coastlines. No palaces, no libraries, no vast forums echoing with senators' voices, only blood, honor, and the law of strength. This was not an empire, it was survival, generation after generation. The Illyrians were warriors by necessity, sailors by birth, and raiders by tradition. The mountains fed their courage, the sea fed their hunger, and piracy? Piracy was not rebellion, it was the economy. While Rome scorned them as barbarians, the Illyrians saw themselves as keepers of the sea. They did not build to impress, they built to endure. Their ships were light, fast, and vicious. They struck without warning. They vanished without trace. To the Illyrians, the Adriatic wasn't a barrier, it was their hunting ground. And from that world of cliffs and iron came a power that would change everything. The Ardii, one tribe among many. But unlike the rest, they united others, not through promises, but through victory. Under King Agron, The Ardiae carved out something dangerously close to a kingdom. Agron was not noble. He was not diplomatic. He was lethal. He ruled with the confidence of a man whose ships could strangle the trade of every Greek port within reach. And he did. He had no illusions of peace. The Illyrians had been preyed upon for centuries by Greek colonists, Macedonian kings, and now Roman traders pretending to be masters. Agron knew, if Illyria did not rule the sea, someone else would. So he seized it. By the time of his death, Agron had become the most powerful Illyrian king in living memory. His fleets dominated the coast. His armies had humbled the Aetolians. The Adriatic feared his name. And then he died. No poison, no assassination, just a sudden sickness after a great victory. He died as he had lived, in war, and left behind something no Illyrian king had dared leave before, a crown and a legacy. And one woman, Teuta. The court called her regent, a placeholder, a widow, nothing more. But Teuta was not waiting to preserve her husband's memory. She was waiting to forge her own, and the empire that gazed across the Adriatic, Rome, misread everything. At that moment, Rome was a rising storm, hardened by its wars with Carthage, greedy for the east and obsessed with order. It saw Illyria not as a sovereign land, but as a nuisance, an uncivilized obstacle between its legions and the riches of Greece. But it made one fatal assumption, that Illyria would fold when pressured, and that Teuta would bow. They saw a queen sitting on a throne built by her husband. What they didn't see was the dagger she kept behind her back. Because Teuta wasn't there to negotiate. She wasn't interested in compromise. She understood exactly what Rome intended. They weren't coming for diplomacy. They were coming for domination. So she moved first. She expanded her navy, fortified her coastline, gave pirates legal protection, and she began to strike, not just defensively, but offensively. Roman merchants, Greek allies, anyone who assumed Illyria could be pushed aside. And as Roman cargo ships began to disappear, the empire realized it was no longer dealing with a grieving widow. They were dealing with a sovereign who had weaponized grief into fury. A woman ruling not in her husband's shadow, but in the growing shadow of empire. She ruled from the coast, yes, but her eyes were on the sea. Because Teuta knew something the Romans didn't. She didn't need to defeat Rome on land. She only had to bleed them in the water. And the water belonged to her. Teuta ruled not from a throne, but from the prow of a fleet. In the years following Agron's death, she transformed Illyria into a war machine, fueled by fear, resolve, and saltwater. What others mistook for mourning was merely quiet preparation. And by the time Rome looked again, the Adriatic was bleeding. Illyrian piracy was no longer scattered or opportunistic. It was deliberate, organized, ruthless. Under Teuta, the coastal waters became a corridor of ambushes. Merchant ships vanished. Crews were slaughtered or sold. Ports, once loyal to Rome, were coerced into silence or allegiance. Every attack bore the same unspoken message: Illyria does not kneel. Teuta wasn't just defending her territory, she was daring her enemies to respond. Greek city-states like Epidamnus and Corcyra cried out for Roman protection, their harbors choked by raids. Rome hesitated. It had fought Carthage and survived, but Illyria was unfamiliar, less predictable, less respectable. Still, the complaints mounted. Trade routes were crumbling. Diplomatic pressure grew. So Rome did what empires do when insulted. It sent messengers. 2 envoys crossed the sea to negotiate. Only one returned. And the one who lived carried more than a report. He carried humiliation. The Senate erupted in fury. They didn't see a queen defending her shores. They saw a savage who had spilled Roman blood without consequence. Honor demanded a response. So did power. And for Teuta, that moment was not a mistake. It was an invitation. War was coming, and she had prepared for it. Illyrian shipyards ramped up production. The Queen extended protection to pirate captains from rival tribes, forging temporary alliances built on shared defiance. She wasn't building an empire. She was building a storm. Rome, in response, dispatched a naval expedition unlike anything Illyria had faced. Consul Gnaeus Fulvius sailed with overwhelming force, legions on ships, banners in the wind. His orders were simple: subdue Illyria, remove the Queen, erase the threat. But Teuta met them with fire. She unleashed her fleet in sudden bursts, striking where Roman ships anchored, crippling their supply lines, disappearing into the fog before counterattacks could form. It was not a war of position. It was a war of momentum. And in those first weeks, she won. Corcyra fell into her hands. Roman allies hesitated. Greek cities held their breath. From her stronghold in Rhizon, Teuta issued commands with clarity and cold purpose. No pleas for negotiation. No delays. This was Illyria's war now. Rome had the numbers. Teuta had the will. And will, when sharpened by desperation, can cut deeper than steel. She wasn't just a ruler. She was a symbol. In the taverns of Illyrian villages and the decks of pirate galleys, her name was spoken with pride. A woman who dared strike the beast and lived. A queen who ruled like a sword unsheathed. But not everyone cheered. Inside her own court, voices grew restless. Tribal chiefs who had once served her husband now questioned the wisdom of provoking a giant. Illyrian nobility murmured about lost trade and the danger of Roman retaliation. But Teuta did not flinch. She knew what they didn't. Rome would come either way, so better to fight while Illyria still held the sea. Still, the tension inside her kingdom grew. The more she struck Rome, the more her enemies within began to watch for her weakness. The Second Roman campaign came harder, faster. With deadlier precision, Fulvius captured Corcyra. Apollonia turned on Illyria. Key ports were seized. One by one, allies abandoned her. Teuta's world, built in rage and daring, began to crack. And yet, she fought. She shifted tactics, ordering land raids to pull Roman forces inland. In the mountains, Illyrian guerrillas harassed supply caravans. Ambushes turned roads into killing fields. But the tide was changing. Rome was relentless. Illyrian towns were burned. Coastal defenses collapsed. Her commanders begged her to negotiate. She refused, until Rhizon itself stood isolated, her final refuge. From within its stone walls, Teuta watched the enemy banners rise across the hills. Rome had come not just to conquer, but to erase. But she wouldn't let them. She ordered one final naval push, a suicide mission meant to break the blockade and reignite the resistance. The ships sailed with fire in their hulls. Some made it through, most did not. And still she watched. Still she commanded. It was only when her council fractured, when her own advisors began sending envoys behind her back, that she saw the end coming not from Rome's swords, but from Illyria's doubt. So she disappeared. No dramatic surrender, no death in battle, only silence. When Rome entered Rhizon, she was gone. No body, no chains, just an empty throne and a kingdom that had already begun to betray her memory. Rome called it victory, but for those who had seen the sea under her rule, they knew better. Teuta had not given them defeat. She had given them legend, and legends never die. Teuta stood surrounded by walls, but it wasn't the stone of Rhizon that held her. It was the closing fist of Rome. Her ships were gone, her allies scattered. The ports that once lit the Illyrian coast like torches now stood dark and occupied. The storm she had unleashed was now turned against her. and it came wearing the red of Roman banners. But still, she didn't run. She stood atop the ramparts of her fortress city, watching Roman galleys cut through her waters like wolves among herds. The sea, once hers, no longer answered her call. The same waves that had carried her name to glory now swallowed her legacy ship by ship. The First Illyrian War had reached its final breath. Rome had unleashed two consuls, Gnaeus Fulvius and Lucius Postumius. Where Fulvius brought brute force, Postumius brought strategy, cutting through Illyria not just with legions, but with propaganda and deals. Cities that once feared Teuta now feared Roman fire more. And the people? They no longer fought. They hid. Illyria had been fractured. Not by conquest, but by exhaustion. Teuta's resistance was no longer a kingdom. It was a woman. But that woman, blooded, isolated, betrayed, still ruled. Inside Rhizon she gave no speeches. She held no councils. There was no time for illusions. She knew. Her final fleet had been crushed, attempting to retake Corcyra. Her trusted captains, loyal to the death, had perished at sea or been hunted through the hills. Rome had pushed her to the cliff's edge, not just militarily, but spiritually. And still, she held. Because surrender, for Teuta, was not politics, it was annihilation. But even iron cracks under pressure. From within her court came whispers. Nobles who had once shouted oaths of loyalty now sent quiet messages across the hills. To Rome, to each other, to anyone who would offer them protection once the queen fell. She had faced betrayal on the sea. Now she faced it in her own halls, and that, more than war, was what broke her. The final decision did not come in the heat of battle. It came in silence, a night with no wind, no flame, no voice. She rose from her seat, walked alone to the war room, and laid her dagger on the map of Illyria, its blade splitting her kingdom in half. The next day, envoys were sent to the Roman camp. Not to beg, to bargain. It was not a surrender they received. It was a deal forged in pain. Teuta would abdicate. Her remaining territories would pass to a Roman-approved client king. Illyrian piracy would end. Roman protection would begin. She was forced to pay tribute to the very empire she had bled. And when she stepped down, she vanished. There is no record of where she went. No tomb, no final speech, only rumors of a cloaked figure retreating into the mountains, of a ship seen slipping north beneath moonlight, of a queen who refused to let her enemies see her fall. Rome declared victory. They claimed the Adriatic, declared piracy extinguished, installed new rulers, redrew borders. But victory tastes bitter when it's born of erosion. Because they didn't kill her. They couldn't. They erased her name from the forums, omitted her from the records, turned her from a sovereign into a footnote. But among the Illyrian coastlands, her story didn't fade. It burned. Fishermen swore her spirit still guarded the waters. Smugglers whispered that no Roman ship would pass the cliffs of Lissus without offering a prayer or a bribe to the queen beneath the waves. Even Roman commanders grew cautious when sailing through her former territory. Superstition, perhaps, or guilt. Because no matter how many provinces they claimed, no matter how many roads they built, there was one truth the empire could never rewrite. For one terrifying moment, the sea did not belong to Rome. It belonged to her. And when the silence finally fell over Illyria, when the last Roman trumpet faded into the hills, one truth remained. Teuta had lost her war, but Rome would never forget the cost of their victory. When the banners fell and the flames were drowned, Illyria was still standing. But it was not the same Illyria. Its coastline was scarred, its cities subdued, and its people pulled into a new order not of their choosing. Rome had arrived, not as a guest, not as a neighbor, but as the new architect of Illyrian life. What began as a war of ships and steel ended as a negotiation inked in exhaustion. Teuta was gone, her name forbidden in some records, distorted in others. In the halls of Roman senators, she became a story, a cautionary tale of barbaric arrogance, a woman who dared to challenge the inevitable, a rebel queen crushed beneath the weight of history. But the reality was more complicated. Rome didn't erase Illyria, it absorbed it. Client kings were installed, puppets with crowns, loyal to Roman interests. The cities once bound by Teuta's command were slowly untied and rewoven into the growing fabric of Roman rule. Fortresses were converted into Roman garrisons. Illyrian warships were either seized or burned. Trade returned, but under Roman taxation and protection. Piracy, once a pillar of the Illyrian economy, was outlawed with brutal efficiency. Captains were hunted down, their ships destroyed in mass burnings across the coast. What had once been a way of life became a death sentence. The sea was no longer free. It had been tamed, but something resisted in silence. Illyrian identity, though politically crushed, refused to vanish. In the mountain villages, in the coastal taverns, her name lingered. Not shouted, but whispered. Not as a queen, but as a myth. The story changed. They no longer told tales of fleets and battles. They spoke of the queen who vanished, of the woman who walked into the mountains and was never seen again. Some said she became a spirit of the sea, punishing Roman arrogance with every shipwreck. Others believed she still lived, guiding smugglers and rebels through secret passages carved in cliffside stone. Teuta ceased to be historical. She became eternal. Rome couldn't control that. And though the region would later fall deeper under Roman administration, eventually becoming the province of Illyricum, its soul remained fractured. Rome had the cities, but the mountains still belonged to the old gods. And the sea still remembered. It wasn't just Illyria that changed. Rome did too. The First Illyrian War forced Rome to adapt its naval strategy, expand its influence into the Balkans, and confront the vulnerabilities of its eastern trade. It marked the beginning of Roman intervention in the Greek world, a path that would lead to far larger conflicts in the years to come. But more than anything, it revealed the limits of control. Because even in victory, Rome found itself haunted by a woman who had refused to play by their rules, a queen who defied definition, too ruthless to be called noble, too principled to be called savage, too dangerous to be forgotten. She had no mausoleum, no statue in Rome, no preserved scrolls of her commands. And yet, her story persisted, through oral tradition, through local legends, through the quiet defiance of people who still remembered what it felt like to be feared, not governed. What was lost? A sovereign Illyria, a warrior queen, an independent sea. What survived? Memory, myth, and a name that even empire couldn't silence. Teuta. History does not often remember women like Teuta, not because they were insignificant, but because they were inconvenient. She ruled, she fought, she defied. She bled for a nation that would later be carved up by men who called her uncivilized. She was never meant to survive in the history books, not as a hero, nor even as a villain. She was meant to be forgotten. And yet, here she stands. Because some legacies aren't carved in stone, they're etched into the sea. Teuta's story is not just about Illyria. It's about resistance in the face of certainty. About the courage to stand when the world tells you to kneel. About how power reacts to women who do not ask for permission and never apologize for that choice. Rome called her a pirate, but piracy, for Teuta, was politics. She used the tools she had, warships instead of treaties, alliances instead of armies, courage in place of numbers. She turned a fractured coast into a unified threat. She turned silence into strategy, and she reminded the world that sovereignty is not something offered. It's something seized. Was she ruthless? Yes. But so were the men who wrote her story. And perhaps that's the point. Teuta never tried to be perfect. She tried to survive, and survival in an age of empire was the most revolutionary act of all. We still debate her legacy. Some call her a rebel queen. Others call her a nationalist before her time. But maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe it's not who she was. Maybe it's what she represents. A leader who saw through the illusion of diplomacy. A woman who knew that when empire knocks at your door, it doesn't come offering peace. It comes to rewrite your future. And she refused to let it. She stood on the shore and said no. And in that moment, she became more than a ruler. She became a message. Even today, her name survives in coastal legends, in songs passed through generations, in stories told by those who remember the sea not as a highway of trade, but as a battlefield of dignity. Teuta's legacy is not one of conquest. It is one of defiance, and in a world still shaped by the ghosts of empire, still echoing with the struggles of the powerless against the powerful, her voice matters. She reminds us that memory is a kind of rebellion, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is rule without fear. Another secret brought back into the light. But the ancient world is vast, and its silence is never empty. If this story stirred something in you, if the past felt closer than ever before, then subscribe to Secrets of the Ancient World and walk deeper with us into what time tried to erase. Because the truth was never lost, it was buried